The morning the trouble began was one of those deceptively calm suburban mornings, the sort that made the whole neighborhood look like a brochure for peaceful living. The cul-de-sac was still cool from the night before, the lawns were meticulously trimmed, and the neighborhood dogs were beginning their ritualistic chorus of barks as joggers made their early loops. Nothing at all hinted at the storm of pettiness that would come crashing through the day. Nothing, that is, except the glaring neon sticker plastered across the hull of my patrol boat. The boat had been parked in my driveway for less than 12 hours, brought home only because the base marina was undergoing emergency dock repairs, a simple inconvenience, nothing more. I had hauled the vessel home the previous night, guided it gently into my wide double driveway, and taken the time to secure every strap and latch before heading inside. The moment I laid down in bed, I felt a ripple of unease. Not because I had brought home a Navy vessel, but because I knew who lived across the strait. She had been the HOA president for 6 years, ruling the neighborhood like a petty monarchy, steeped in bylaws, fines, and self-appointed authority. A woman whose tidy haircut seemed as sharp as her voice, whose clipboard acted as her scepter, whose gaze held the energy of someone always one accusation away from erupting. The neighborhood called her Karen behind closed doors, sometimes out of frustration, sometimes out of documentation, because she truly embodied the full mythos of the name. And apparently, sometime between the moment I parked my federal military patrol craft and the moment I went to bed, her compulsive need for control had overridden even her limited sense of self-preservation. The sticker wasn't subtle. It glowed a blinding neon peach, slapped directly over the identification markings on the hull. The words were printed in an aggressive, all-caps font, a bureaucratic attempt at intimidation. The message declared the vessel in violation of HOA guidelines, unapproved, unauthorized, and subject to towing. Towing. Someone, somewhere in her imagination, thought a suburban towing company was going to hitch up a 37-foot Navy patrol boat, federal property, military asset, registered and tracked, and drag it down the block like it was an abandoned sedan. She hadn't just stepped over the line, she had sprinted across it with the enthusiasm of someone who had no idea which laws she was shattering. I stood in the driveway staring at the tag, and for a long moment the only sound was the faint flapping of the sticker's loose corner in the breeze. It felt surreal. Even the neighbors slowed their morning routines, glancing toward me with the universal expression of people who knew something dramatic was about to unfold. Because in this neighborhood, when Karen took action, everyone else braced for the fallout. It wasn't the inconvenience that irritated me. It was the audacity. The patrol boat was not just another vehicle, it was federal property marked with coded identifiers that tied directly into Navy inventory systems. The hull plating wasn't steel you could key or dent without consequence. The vessel represented months of mission work, countless hours on the water, and no small amount of logistics. It wasn't easily replaced, and it wasn't something anyone should be attaching unauthorized notices to. The adhesive itself left residue behind. The adhesive clung aggressively to the paint, already requiring specialized removal solvents just to avoid damage. It was a small offense when taken alone, but symbolically it carried far more weight, tampering with federal equipment, defacing military property, interfering with operational readiness. An HOA violation notice in this context read like a confession of ignorance. Still, I peeled it slowly. The adhesive crackled and resisted. Bits of it clung to the hull like stubborn barnacles. As I worked, I could feel her eyes on me. Sure enough, she had stationed herself on her porch with a mug of coffee clutched like a trophy, watching, monitoring, waiting for confrontation. Her self-appointed jurisdiction had reached the climax she lived for. It was peculiar how she justified her authority. In her mind, the HOA bylaws superseded federal statutes. Her porch acted as a throne from which she surveyed her suburban kingdom, and any object, person, or circumstance not fitting her aesthetic vision was deemed a threat that must be neutralized. Boats, sheds, Slightly tall grass, wind chimes that were fractionally louder than allowed. She documented them all with militaristic zeal. The irony was almost comical. As I removed the last stubborn strip of adhesive, a sense of quiet calculation settled into place. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the awareness that her intrusion had crossed into a world she didn't understand. The Navy did not look kindly on civilian interference. The chain of command bureaucracy that she weaponized for HOA enforcement operated on an entirely different scale within the military. She had treated a Navy vessel like a misplaced lawn ornament, and consequences would be inevitable, whether she anticipated them or not. The neighbors sensed it too. A few drifted closer under the guise of checking their mail or adjusting their sprinklers. Their glances flicked from the boat to me, then to Karen. They recognized the imbalance of power. The unstoppable force of federal procedure was about to collide with the immovable object of suburban self-importance, and they wanted ringside seats. Before long, the sun fully breached the rooftops, casting sharp shadows across the street. The patrol boat gleamed in the morning light, unmistakably official, unmistakably out of place among minivans and sedans. The sight emphasized what should have been obvious. This was not subject to HOA whims. It was not under civilian jurisdiction. It was here temporarily out of necessity and would be gone the moment base repairs were complete. Yet her expression remained confident, smug even. She believed she had caught me in violation. She believed the sticker had power. She believed she stood on the right side of the rules. It didn't matter whether she understood them. By the time the adhesive was fully removed, I had already formed the plan for what came next. Not revenge, not confrontation, simply the proper reporting steps one follows when unauthorized civilians interfere with military equipment. Nothing more, nothing less. A process far above any HOA guideline or suburban decree. And as fate would have it, the next step in that process would arrive sooner than she expected. For just as I turned toward the house, preparing to gather the documentation I needed, the rumble of an approaching government vehicle rolled into the neighborhood, unmistakable, official, and heading directly toward us. A natural break formed in the tension. Something was about to happen, something she had not planned for, and the real story was only beginning.
The rumble that echoed down the street carried a weight the neighborhood wasn't used to hearing. It wasn't the growl of a landscaping truck or the roar of a modified pickup. It was controlled, steady, unmistakably official. As the vehicle approached, the residents paused mid-routine. Joggers slowed to a stop. A dog walker turned his head, tugging his overly enthusiastic retriever back to the sidewalk. Even the neighbor who usually blasted morning talk radio through an open garage door reached for the volume knob as the dark SUV turned into the cul-de-sac. Government plates, discreet rooftop lights, a silhouette that made it clear it wasn't here to deliver mail or issue parking reminders. It rolled forward with a deliberate pace, heading straight toward the patrol boat in my driveway, toward me, and inevitably toward the woman watching from her perch like an overzealous sentry. Her mug of coffee lowered slightly as she leaned forward. Even at a distance, her composure wavered. She wasn't used to being observed by anyone with legitimate authority. Her power typically flowed downward, from her clipboard to the homeowners she regulated. A reversal, however temporary, visibly unsettled her. The SUV eased to a stop at the edge of my driveway. The door opened. Two individuals stepped out, both wearing plainclothes, but unmistakably federal personnel. Their posture carried the quiet confidence of people who dealt with real threats, not alleged lawn ornament offenses. They glanced over the vessel, eyes narrowing at the remnants of adhesive still clinging to the hull. Their attention sharpened as they examined the residue. Across the street, the HOA president straightened herself. The shift in her stance was subtle but telling. Her shoulders squared, her chin elevated, a posture she used when preparing to insert herself into matters that didn't concern her.
The possibility that these officials might reinforce her assumed authority clearly buoyed her confidence. She had no idea how wrong she was. The agents began documenting the haul, taking photographs and noting the placement of the sticker residue. Their professionalism was steady, almost clinical. They didn't ask why the vessel was parked here. That part was known. They asked only about the tampering. Their voices were low, calm, procedural, tones that carried no panic, only duty. As they worked, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The neighbors, sensing a gravity beyond the usual HOA disputes, drifted closer, but kept respectful distance. Conversations whispered at the edges of lawns. Someone speculated about the sticker. Others wondered who would dare interfere with a Navy vessel. The speculation never named her directly, but all glances drifted inevitably toward the porch across the street. She stood rigid now, clutching her mug like a prop. Her expression betrayed a growing confusion. She didn't understand why the tone was serious, why the agents weren't smiling politely at her presence, why they weren't acknowledging her authority as HOA president. She waited for a moment to assert herself, a gap in conversation to announce her involvement. That moment never came. Instead, the agents asked their questions with quiet efficiency. I answered with equal calm. The process moved forward without space for her to insert herself. It became clear that their visit wasn't about permission to park. It was about the unauthorized sticker. A clear chain of events, a clear protocol triggered by tampering with federal property. Nothing she said or believed about HOA bylaws mattered here. Finally, as if unable to stand the exclusion any longer, she stepped forward. She didn't approach boldly, rather she drifted with forced casualness, attempting to appear as an invested community leader rather than the cause of the inspection. Her mug trembled slightly in her hand, either from nerves or the thrill of entering a drama she believed she controlled. She took her place at the edge of my driveway, standing a little too close, positioning herself like someone prepared to deliver a formal report. She opened her mouth, likely preparing to recite the section of the HOA guidelines she believed applied. But before she could release even a sound, the nearest agent glanced in her direction, not dismissively, but with the neutral, unwavering expression of someone assessing an unknown variable. The weight of that single look silenced her. It conveyed everything she had failed to consider. She was not in charge here. She was not an authority figure in this context. She was to them merely a bystander at best, and, depending on the investigation's outcome, a potential witness or something else entirely. Her mouth remained open for an awkward beat before closing again. She stepped back the slightest amount, as if unsure whether she was retreating or resetting her stance. The agents continued documenting the vessel, occasionally examining the exact location where the sticker had been placed. The adhesive, despite my efforts to remove it, was still visibly etched into the paint surface. Their notepads filled with observations. Their photographs captured every angle. The quiet professionalism of their work was, in its own way, damning. As the longer they remained, the more the HOA president's confidence eroded. She shifted her weight from foot to foot. Her eyes darted to the neighbors who watched with thinly concealed fascination. Every movement betrayed her growing realization that this situation had spiraled beyond her control. And then, just as she likely began convincing herself that perhaps she could slip back across the street unnoticed, one of the agents spoke, not to her, but loud enough that her presence became unavoidable. He mentioned the phrase, tampering with federal property. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't directed at her, it was simply protocol, part of the documentation process. But the words struck her like a sudden gust of wind. She stiffened, her knuckles whitened around the mug's handle. She stood so still for a moment that even the neighbors stopped pretending not to watch. Her breathing visibly hitched. She swallowed, and the motion was exaggerated enough to betray her fear. The gravity of the situation had finally pierced her assumption of superiority. Federal property, tampering, investigation, words she had never expected to collide with the world of HOA fines and lawn height regulations. As the agents wrapped up their documentation, they informed me, again calmly and professionally, that a formal report would follow. Their tone held no urgency, only procedure. The visit was merely step one. But for her, standing frozen across the driveway, it may as well have been a courtroom verdict. The agents returned to their vehicle, their quiet efficiency unshaken. The engine started. The SUV rolled away as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving behind a silence that amplified everything she didn't want to confront. I turned toward the house, aware that this was only the beginning. Policies would be triggered, protocols would unfold, and her name, whether she liked it or not, would inevitably surface in the documentation. As I reached the front steps, I could feel her gaze on my back, heavy with dread. The story had shifted permanently, and the next stage was already on its way.
The days that followed settled into a tense, almost electric quiet, the sort that made the air feel charged even when nothing appeared to be happening. Word of the patrol boat incident spread through the neighborhood faster than lawn gossip usually traveled. People who would otherwise never take an interest in HOA politics suddenly found themselves attending evening walks with no particular destination, pausing conspicuously near my driveway as if the vessel might speak its own testimony. And across the street, the HOA president, once so poised in her self-appointed authority, was unraveling in gradual, observable increments. Her routine had become erratic. The rigid morning patrols with her clipboard grew shorter. The brief, familiar stops she usually made in front of each problem property became inconsistent, as though she feared that any additional scrutiny might cast a more damning light on her recent actions. Even the neighbors noticed the subtle shift, and their whispers sharpened as they observed her decline. Yet she clung desperately to one final bastion of control, the monthly HOA meeting. She announced it with an air of forced confidence, slipping printed notices into mailboxes 2 days early, an unprecedented move clearly intended to reclaim authority. The notice included a bolded agenda line reading "Parking and Property Compliance Concerns." The phrasing, vague as it was, reeked of her attempt to reframe the situation in her favor. But by the evening of the meeting, the residents arrived in numbers far exceeding typical attendance. Chairs filled the small community clubhouse. Extra folding seats formed uneven rows along the back wall. Some people stood by the door, murmuring among themselves as the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew why the attendance was so high. Everyone knew what was coming. The HOA president stepped to the front of the room, clutching her stack of notes with the stiff, trembling composure of someone preparing to perform a routine she no longer believed in. She arranged her papers with exaggerated precision, straightening corners, tapping edges, trying to convince herself and everyone else that she still held the reins. The moment she spoke, however, her voice carried a quiver she couldn't mask. She welcomed the community, thanked them for their heightened engagement, and attempted to launch into the rotating list of trivial updates, trash pickup changes, landscaping reminders, the yearly neighborhood festival. But her audience wasn't here for any of that. They waited and waited until the agenda reached the item everyone had come to witness. When she finally reached parking and property compliance concerns, she paused, as if preparing to deliver a speech she had rehearsed in front of a mirror. She inhaled slowly, a visible bracing of her nerves, then began to outline vague references to vehicles of unusual scale, improper notice procedures, and temporary enforcement measures. She danced around specifics with the finesse of a politician avoiding direct blame. Her tone attempted authority, her cadence attempted confidence, but the tremor in her words betrayed her, because she knew even before she finished her first sentence that the room was shifting against her.
Cracks began to appear almost immediately. A few residents exchanged skeptical glances. Someone in the second row crossed their arms tightly. Others leaned forward, anticipating the moment when subtlety would break and someone would finally challenge her narrative. And then it happened. A single resident, mild-mannered, typically quiet, cleared his throat. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his hand. He simply looked at her with a level, unimpressed stare that somehow conveyed every question the neighborhood had been too polite to vocalize. Why did you sticker a Navy patrol boat? Did you think the HOA could override federal jurisdiction? What consequences are we facing because of your impulsiveness? She faltered under the weight of that silent accusation. Her papers shook. She shuffled them again, but this time her motions were frantic rather than precise. The veneer of composure cracked. She tried to pivot, claiming she had merely followed protocol. She insisted she acted in the interest of neighborhood aesthetics. She claimed she had no knowledge of the vessel's classification. But her excuses collided with the undeniable reality that federal agents had appeared less than 24 hours after her interference. The room grew restless. A low murmur spread across the rows like the opening rumble of an approaching storm. Some residents exchanged knowing nods, already aware that her actions had spiraled far beyond the routine domain of HOA policy. Others cast subtle glances in my direction, waiting to see whether I would intervene. I remained silent. Not out of avoidance, but because this moment didn't need my voice. It needed her to face her own reflection in the eyes of the people she had long treated as subjects rather than neighbors. Finally, someone spoke up, a woman from the back row who had dealt with years of petty fines for minor infractions. Her tone wasn't aggressive, it was weary. She asked, simply and directly, whether the HOA president understood the consequences of tampering with government property. The question hit like a thrown stone. The HOA president stammered, dodging the inquiry entirely. She insisted they move on, claiming the matter was being handled, though she offered no explanation as to who was handling it, or how, or why she believed herself absolved. Her composure crumbled further. She grew defensive. She blamed unclear guidelines. She suggested that had she known the vessel was federal, she might have behaved differently. She spoke of mistaken assumptions, attempting to paint her interference as a harmless misunderstanding. But the room was no longer sympathetic. The tone had shifted. People were no longer questioning details. They were questioning her leadership. Her voice rose sharper with each justification, her gestures more frantic, her smile more strained. She snapped at a resident who asked for clarification. She dismissed another who questioned her authority. She attempted to steer the meeting back to routine topics, but her audience no longer followed. They were no longer intimidated, and her power, once based entirely on fear of fines and petty enforcement, was dissolving before her eyes. The unraveling reached its peak when an elderly neighbor, normally soft-spoken, asked whether she had already been contacted by federal authorities regarding the sticker. The question was direct, unavoidable, and dangerously pointed. Her face flushed. Her mouth opened, but no words escaped. She blinked rapidly, scrambling for a response that wouldn't betray her anxiety. The silence that followed answered the question for her. The residents exchanged looks that needed no verbal confirmation. They understood. The HOA president had overreached in a catastrophic way, and now the fallout was looming over her like a gathering thundercloud. As the meeting dissolved into chaotic side conversations, she abruptly called for adjournment. Her attempt at regaining control was ineffective. People continued talking even as she slammed her folder shut and fled the room, leaving her dignity scattered behind her like torn pages. And as the crowd slowly filtered out into the cool evening air, it was clear that the neighborhood had changed. Power had shifted. Perceptions had crystallized. The next chapter of the conflict was no longer about a sticker, but about accountability. And accountability was officially on its way.
The days after the explosive HOA meeting took on a strange duality. On the surface, the neighborhood looked unchanged. Lawns still immaculate, sprinklers still humming in rhythmic arcs, morning joggers still tracing familiar paths along the sidewalks. But beneath that quiet veneer, a tension simmered like something electrical. Conversations that once drifted lazily between weather and weekend plans now pulsed with speculation about what would happen next. Across the street, the HOA president retreated into a self-imposed isolation. Her porch, once command center of her suburban reign, sat empty. No mug of coffee, no clipboard resting on the patio table, no early morning patrols. Even her blinds stayed half-drawn, revealing only fleeting glimpses of her silhouette pacing through the rooms with the restless energy of someone running through every possible consequence in their mind. The neighbors noticed. They always noticed. Some believed she was preparing a defense. Others thought she was scrambling to reassert authority, and a growing number believed she was waiting for the inevitable knock, the official update, the moment when her decisions returned not in the form of community frustration, but in something far more formal. That moment arrived earlier than anyone expected. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of bright, cloudless morning that usually promised a peaceful day. The sunlight spilled across the cul-de-sac and soft pulled, glinting off the patrol boat, still sitting in my driveway, still an unignorable monument to everything she had done. I had just stepped out to inspect the hall again, ensuring no further tampering had occurred, when the sound of a slow, deliberate vehicle engine drew my attention. Not the black SUV from before. This time, a different official vehicle rounded the corner, its presence unmistakably bureaucratic. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried authority in its purposeful crawl, headlights scanning the addresses with precision. The neighbors, as if cued by some silent alarm, drifted toward windows. Curtains shifted, blinds parted. People on morning walks slowed their pace, turning subtle glances toward the approaching car. Everyone sensed the significance. The vehicle came to a stop in front of her house. Its door opened, and a uniformed courier stepped out. Not a federal agent, but clearly someone from a government office handling the administrative end of the emerging situation. He held a slim folder under his arm and an envelope in his hand, sealed and marked with official insignia. She must have been watching from inside, because the moment the courier stepped onto her walkway, the door cracked open. She didn't fling it wide or greet her with her usual assertiveness. She peeked out like someone expecting bad news. Her expression was strained, pale, eyes red from sleepless nights, shoulders tense under the weight of her own anxieties. The courier spoke softly, too softly for anyone else to hear, but his body language conveyed the formality of the exchange. He handed her the envelope. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she accepted what could not be ignored or denied. A few neighbors pretended to be out tending gardens, though their heads tilted unmistakably toward the scene. Others paused at the end of driveways. Even the usually oblivious dog walker slowed enough to observe. The HOA president stared down at the envelope, as if expecting it to burn her hand. The courier said a few more words, likely procedural instructions, then turned and departed with crisp efficiency. No lingering, no sympathy. She closed the door behind her with the slow, heavy finality of someone sealing herself inside a sinking ship. What happened next spread through the neighborhood in hourly whispers. The envelope contained official notice of involvement in a federal property tampering investigation. Not a charge, not an accusation, but an administrative step notifying that her actions had triggered a review. She was expected to provide a written statement. She was instructed not to interfere further with the vessel, and she was informed that any attempt to alter or withhold details could carry consequences far beyond HOA bylaws.
It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, it was procedural. And that terrified her more than anything, because she couldn't argue with procedure. She couldn't intimidate procedure. She couldn't fine procedure for non-compliance. She could only obey it. By midday, she emerged from her house again, but not in the authoritative posture the neighborhood had grown accustomed to. She looked smaller somehow, humbled by the weight of realities she could no longer deny. Her steps were slow, almost reluctant as she made her way to her mailbox, checking for further correspondence with the nervousness of someone expecting bad news to multiply. But the neighborhood wasn't finished rearranging itself around her collapse. That afternoon, several members of the HOA board, not her, but the others she had long treated as subordinates, called for an emergency meeting. This was unheard of. Traditionally, nothing moved without her direction, but this time they bypassed her entirely. They met in one board member's driveway, gathering with clipboards of their own, but their postures were firm and purposeful in a way that signaled a shift in power. The residents noticed that, too. People lingered on front lawns. Some leaned casually against mailboxes. Others pretended to check garden beds, but all eyes gravitated toward the small gathering of board members quietly deliberating. Their expressions were serious, not angry, not gossipy, but concerned in a way that carried the weight of responsibility they could no longer ignore. They didn't announce the outcome that day, but their decision became evident when the HOA president received a second piece of correspondence in her mailbox, this one hand-delivered by the board itself. It wasn't a punishment, it wasn't a reprimand, it was a suspension of authority pending review. Her porch light flickered on that evening at an unusually early hour. She sat on her front steps, hands clasped tightly, posture stiff with humiliation. It was the first time in years she occupied that space without projecting dominance. She looked out across the neighborhood slowly, absorbing the quiet judgment in the air. She had spent years governing the cul-de-sac with a sense of superiority rooted entirely in perceived power. Now she sat alone, powerless, facing the consequences of a choice she couldn't undo. The sun set behind the rooftops, throwing long shadows across the street. The patrol boat remained in my driveway, illuminated softly by the fading light, a silent symbol of everything that had shifted. And as the first porch lights blinked to life across the neighborhood, signaling the end of a long, tense day, one thing became certain. The final reckoning was close, very close.
The final chapter of the ordeal began quietly, so quietly that at first no one realized how close the end truly was. A stillness settled over the neighborhood, the kind that often comes just before a breaking point. The HOA president's porch remained vacant. Her windows stayed dim, the blinds never lifted. She moved like a faint presence behind them, a ghost drifting through the rooms she once surveyed with unshakable confidence. The patrol boat remained unmoved in my driveway, gleaming in the waning winter sun, like a monument to everything she had misjudged. It was no longer a source of curiosity. Instead, it had become an emblem of consequences, consequences she had triggered with nothing more than an impulsive sticker and an inflated sense of authority. The neighborhood had begun to adjust around it, as though accepting that the vessel, for now, was as much a fixture of the street as the mailbox clusters and ornamental shrubs. But everything, absolutely everything, would change in a single afternoon. It happened on a Thursday, the sort of day that felt suspended between seasons. The air carried the faint crispness of winter leaving and spring approaching, and the neighborhood was unusually active for a weekday. Children played outside, retirees tended gardens, people walked their dogs in slow, looping routes that gave them multiple vantage points of the patrol boat and the house across from it.
I was inside reviewing paperwork for the investigation when the familiar sound of an approaching engine interrupted the quiet. This time, the sound wasn't urgent or forceful. It was measured, a steady, heavy rumble that signaled official business without theatrics. A white government sedan turned onto the street. Not law enforcement, not the previous agents. This was someone else, someone administrative, someone higher in the procedural chain, whose presence meant the matter had reached its final stage. The sedan eased to a stop directly in front of the HOA president's house. The driver, an older man in a crisp uniform adorned with insignia reflecting high-level administrative authority, stepped out with a folder tucked securely beneath his arm. His movements were deliberate, calm, rehearsed from years of carrying out formal duties that rarely intersected with suburban politics. Once again, the neighborhood froze. People paused mid-conversation. Doorbells chimed as curious residents stepped onto porches pretending to retrieve packages. Someone watering their garden accidentally let the hose pool at their feet while staring. Everyone knew what this visit meant. The HOA president must have been watching from inside because she opened the door a heartbeat after the official stepped onto her walkway. But the version of her that appeared was not the domineering figure the neighborhood had grown accustomed to. Her posture slumped. Her expression carried the weight of sleepless nights and unending speculation. The official greeted her with a firm, professional nod and handed over the folder. The envelope atop it bore a seal unmistakable even from a distance. She took it with hands that trembled, not subtly this time, but openly, visibly shaken. The man spoke for a few moments, his tone steady and formal. She nodded repeatedly, swallowing hard. When he finished, he stepped back, gave her one final nod, then returned to his car and drove away without ceremony. The moment he disappeared around the corner, she closed the door with the slow, crushing inevitability of someone sealing the final chapter of their own downfall. News spread through the neighborhood within hours. The letter wasn't an arrest notice, it wasn't a criminal charge, but its implications were unmistakably serious. It was an official determination that she had interfered with federal property. While the situation didn't rise to the level of criminal prosecution, largely because the damage was minimal, the interference had been quickly documented, and I had made clear that I wasn't seeking punitive legal action. The consequences were nonetheless substantial. She was ordered to complete a formal educational compliance program regarding federal property. She was required to pay a fine, one significantly larger than any she had ever levied on residents, and she was barred from participating or leading any organization with enforcement authority for a period of several years. In other words, she was permanently removed from the HOA. The board formalized her removal the next day. The notice was posted publicly on the community bulletin board and emailed to every resident. Her suspension from leadership became a full dismissal, her privileges revoked, her role dissolved. The neighborhood exhaled a collective breath it didn't realize it had been holding. Power shifted permanently. Conversations that once cowered beneath the possibility of her scrutiny now blossomed openly. People joked about lawn heights without fear. Garden gnomes mysteriously appeared in front yards where whimsical decorations had long been forbidden. The sense of oppressive control lifted like fog burned off by the rising sun. And across the street, she remained inside, blinds drawn, silent. In the days that followed, she retreated further into isolation. Yard maintenance services arrived in her driveway, hired by necessity rather than preference. Her mailbox filled and emptied at odd hours, always when the neighborhood was quietest. Her presence shrank until she became almost invisible, a fading detail in a story that outgrown her.
The patrol boat, meanwhile, was scheduled to return to base as the marina repairs neared completion, and on the morning it departed, the neighborhood gathered quietly, not as a spectacle, but as a moment of closure. They stood respectfully as I prepared the vessel for transport, watching as if witnessing the final piece of a long, wearying puzzle sliding into place. When the boat rolled out of the driveway, the cul-de-sac felt lighter, peaceful, restored. And as it disappeared from view, several neighbors nodded to each other, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. The patrol boat had never been the problem. It had simply revealed one. In the aftermath, the HOA reorganized. Leadership changed hands. Rules were rewritten with fairness in mind. The neighborhood began to heal from the quiet reign of fear that had dominated it for so long. As for the former HOA president, she remained in her house for several more weeks. Eventually, a moving truck appeared one morning, and by sunset, she was gone, slipping away without farewells, leaving behind only the memory of a power she had once wielded carelessly. The neighborhood woke the next day to a new quiet, one that felt peaceful rather than tense. Children played freely, residents chatted without glancing over their shoulders, and for the first time in years, the cul-de-sac felt like a community again. The saga ended not with confrontation, but with consequence, and in the end, the simple truth was undeniable. All it took to topple a self-appointed tyrant was a single sticker placed where it never should have been, a sticker that dared to claim authority over a patrol boat that answered to a far higher one.